ideally, I would be an anarchist in ideals. I hate everything that the government has done so far.
What about Russia? Russia's not invading a NATO country.
Not now. I'm saying they need to
Never.
build up the
They
military.
won't. They won't. Even with the military, because it'd be nuclear war. It'd be over.
No, it wouldn't.
Yes, it would be.
No. Conventional warfare between two nuclear countries does not necessarily mean that you're.
It would if it was between Russia and NATO and the United States. This is why Russia and the U.S. are so careful not to cross swords. It's because they know that that's where it could eventually lead, right?
It could. That doesn't mean it will.
No, but I don't think Russia's ever invading a NATO country.
Are you ready to get banned from YouTube?
My name is Bailey Cole. I am the treasurer for Aggies for Liberty on campus,
Okay.
and I am also a Libertarian Party candidate for Brazos County Justice of the Peace.
Gotcha. All right.
Yeah.
My name's Steven. I think Joe Biden is doing a tremendous job in office.
So, when you say good, are you talking about relative to other presidents or in an absolute sense?
In an absolute sense, in terms of like what are the decisions he could be making, and then I mean relative to other presidents, I guess I'd say too, but that's a harder one because obviously you have to deal with the situations with the hand you're dealt when you come into office. So.
All right. So I just would have to ask, like, what? Because I know who you are, but I don't actually watch it, so I couldn't articulate your positions.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly do you think it is that Joe Biden has done that is good? Like, at least like a couple specific examples.
Sure. So I think that all of the decisions he's made foreign policy-wise in regards to Ukraine, I think have been almost perfect. I would say that legislatively, it's been pretty amazing that he was able to get the infrastructure bill passed. I think that the accomplishments he had under the coronavirus relief, I think was really good. The passing the expanded child tax credit and everything, and then like on a kind of overarching level, like his general trying to work with both sides and not being like an extreme progressive and not trying to be like extremely far left. I think it's been pretty positive for kind of like cooling down the political discourse in the country without constantly demonizing the other side. And then we can get more specific if you want on any of those topics.
Okay. I don't necessarily know that he is tried to cool anything down. I think he's just mostly not done anything, and that has done enough because the last couple presidents have been very bad at just ramping up tensions in the country.
Well, he's already had. What do you mean not done anything? He's had some major legislative accomplishments.
No, I'm talking about from the sense of tensions.
Oh, okay.
Because I was focusing on that one first, but
I feel like when I speak about him cooling things down. So I think that the statements of I'm not the president for the Democrats, I'm the president for all of the United States. I think his constantly trying to get Republicans on board with legislation he's trying to pass, I think is better than just saying we're going to do what we can with 50. We're going to do what we can through budget reconciliation. We're going to do what we can in the Senate with 51 votes, et cetera, et cetera. I think trying to bring Republicans to the table to negotiate on stuff is something that I find admirable. But
I don't know of any real secessions that he's made to Republicans at all.
The infrastructure bill was voted on by there were 16 Senate Republicans that joined the Democrats on that bill. It's pretty good.
Yeah,
it's a pretty big infrastructure bill.
I hate all of those Republicans. So
well, of course you guys are. You call them all rhinos.
No. They're actual Republicans. I'm just a libertarian. Big L libertarian member of the Libertarian Party. They're all awful, both sides.
Okay.
But no, everything about that infrastructure bill was just awful. The way they increased the IRS was insane. The IRS.
What an awesome idea! How could you be against the increase of the IRS?
It's the IRS. It's an awful system.
It's one of the only things that actually makes money in our government. We need more IRS agents, of course.
By taxing citizens and taking money from them.
That's how governments work. Yeah, you have to tax citizens to pay for the government.
They're never going to decrease taxes in any meaningful way ever.
That's not what the IRS's job is. The problem with the IRS as it existed prior to that bill was that there are billions of dollars out there that the IRS knows are out there, but they don't have the agents to go after it. I think expanding the IRS is one of the only revenue positive things where when you throw more money at it, it makes more money for the government. I feel like of all the agencies we could talk about in the U.S. government of increasing funding to the IRS, the most obvious one.
So here's my question: why didn't the Democrats, despite all of their rhetoric about not wanting to go after Americans under $400,000, reject the Crapo Amendment?
What was that amendment specifically?
The Crapo Amendment said that any of the new funding going towards those 87,000 new IRS agents would be not used to go under Americans with an income of less than $400,000 a year. It was proposed by a Republican. It's named after one of them, Crapo, and it was voted down on party lines by Democrats over Republicans.
I would have to see the specific language of the bill, but I don't know why you would exclude Americans earning less than $400K from the IRS.
That was the main talking point that Democrats used to try and get the bill through public opinion.
Okay.
And they voted against it on their own practice. It was straight up just a lie across the board.
I wish I knew the specific language of the bill. I know that, for instance, when you are doing audits, I know that the Republicans have required that people earning people qualifying for the EITC, I think, have to be audited at a certain percentage. It's either like 5% of like EITC earners have to be audited, which is actually a huge waste of IRS resources. So I would have to see the specific language of the bill, but I don't know why you would hire new IRS agents and then like gimp their ability to go after certain types of income. Like I know that
again, no, I would actually
agree.
agree with you on that sense. It makes no sense to add the IRS agents and not do that. But at the same time, that was the primary rhetoric behind getting the bill's public support, was saying that they would not go after Americans under 400,000. So everything they said about getting support for that infrastructure bill was straight up a lie, and it's a provable lie.
I would have to see the exact statements made, because I know a lot of statements get rung around in terms of like what people say they said and what was actually agreed on, and I have to see the exact amendment, but I don't have the language of that bill in front of me, unfortunately. But
I mean that's fair.
But I mean like even regardless, if that was like the primary selling point, I would have said, oh well, that's kind of dumb. Like that shouldn't be the primary selling point. But I'm still like policy wise like in favor of expanding the IRS if that means being able to go after more tax revenue that's out there that they can't right now. They don't have the manpower to.
And again, one of my big issues on taxes is that people basically use the government uses excuses constantly to put things temporarily in place to then permanently jack them up. So a good example of this would be income tax to begin with. It was started during World War I as a temporary measure only for the richest people, and it was only 2%. Now, every single person in the middle class has to deal with an insane amount of federal income tax. And this is a serious problem that the government has across the board. They continuously use specific crises to then jack up to then jack up later federal laws that just never ever go away. I mean, the FDR's New Deal is a good example of this. A lot of those programs that were designed specifically for the Great Depression are still around today, despite not really providing the same benefit that they did then.
That might be the case, but I'm not here to argue in favor of like should permanent programs that now or that came about 100 years ago should or shouldn't be in place anymore. Like if there's a specific program we're going to talk about, I can talk about whether or not I defend or not defend that particular program. But like I don't think we can get rid of income tax and still have the federal government function in the way that it does right now.
Well, no, that's why we should get rid of most of the federal government.
Yeah, but I don't know anybody that's in favor of getting rid of most of the federal government.
We could start with the FBI, the ATF, and the Federal Reserve.
So how do we investigate federal crimes with no FBI?
There are, I think honestly, in a real sense, it would be a better system to get rid of all of the auxiliary investigatory agencies like the ATF, the DEA, and ICE, and then combine them into a simplified agency that covers everything and on a much more limited scale. But
well, I mean,
that would be the initial way to do it, because the current system of the FBI is horrible. The program,
horrible how? In what ways?
The FBI was initially designed to go after political dissidents.
Okay, don't care about initially. The libertarian arguments were like, well, 100 years ago it was like this. That's
not
relevant. The world has changed.
The
right?
problem is it hasn't changed. They still do this today.
What is the issue? Like you say, like the FBI is like a horrible or terrible organization. Like what is like a big change you'd want to see in the FBI?
I would like to see all of the high-level positions basically taken out. I would like them to be not a executive agency responsible to the president. I would like to see them be responsible probably to Congress directly.
Responsible to Congress directly. Why Congress over the executive branch?
Because the executive branch at any one time is controlled specifically by one party, whereas Congress is controlled usually by, at least in large parts, both parties.
Couldn't that argument be used to basically strip every single agency from the executive branch then and then put it over to Congress?
No. I think the biggest issue specifically with the FBI is that it can be used under Trump's administration, under Biden's administration, under Obama's administration to target political dissidents. And in that sense, as long as it is controlled specifically by one person and one party, then that can be targeted at the other party regardless.
I mean, it theoretically could be, but I mean, like, theoretically things could happen from, like, congressional committees as well, right? Like, it feels strange because, like, the legislative branch of our government already has, like, so much power. Like, they can overrule the president in several ways that to start stripping things from the executive.
Well, I mean, they've outsourced most of their actual job to executive agencies.
I think that, well, I mean, most of those executive agencies will come from like some piece of legislation in Congress that says like we're granting the president the authority to make an agent to do this, and then they kind of figure out exactly like how are they going to enforce the law. But
yes, but it should not. It was never designed that the FDA would be the ones that make laws on how drugs and food is processed. That was supposed to be Congress's job. They then outsourced that to the FDA and said we're not going to touch it. Now you have a system that makes the laws through the FDA, The FDA then investigates any breaches in those laws, and they have their own courts to justify those fines. So
well, I think every executive agency has their own. There's a name for it, like the
their
Office
own
of
their own courts. Yes.
Yeah, well, and they've got their own it's a separate investigatory body for every federal agency. I should remember what these are called, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But those are supposed to run independent. Like anytime you hear a story where it's like watch blowers have figured out this, it's because of the office of whatever that's serving as a counterpoint to that federal agency. If there's a big problem with like the FDA, just because it exists under the executive doesn't mean that we can't change it in Congress. Like we can pass laws congressionally to change how the president is enacting certain things executively. So it seems like if there was a huge issue we had with the FDA, whether it was ran by Congress or the president, like the change would happen because if we hated it so much in Congress it would change. We'd be passing legislation already in Congress to change how the executive carries it out. No.
In theory, yes. However, I think while I think it's a good thing that Congress needs extensive debates to really do anything productive, and it intentionally slows them down, I think the way that presidents have recently been using executive orders, and this includes pretty much every single president of the 21st century, the president has found a lot of ways to sort of get around certain things. A number of executive agencies or executive orders have just been awful and borderline unconstitutional, honestly.
Sure, but we say borderline unconstitutional, but I mean the Supreme Court's there to check any challenges that come through. It feels like your problem is less with the organization of the government, that these executive agencies exist at the behest of the president, and your issue is more like these agencies ever existing at all. Like I have a feeling that
that's
if
part
the FDA
of it, yes.
and the FBI existed under Congress, you'd still be like, well, we still need to abolish them because I don't like the FDA and the FBI. Right?
Well, yes, but I have an entire rant about drug laws and why the FDA is awful on that front. But
sure, but I mean, they'd be just as awful
under
Congress, right?
What I'm saying is I think it would be less bad there. And I'm not here to, I am not here, like, ideally I would be an anarchist and like in ideals. I hate everything that the government has done so far. But I also recognize in practicality that's just never going to happen, and it wouldn't just work for the vast majority of people. So I'm willing to stand here and say that we should not make perfection the enemy of progress. And I think that while I would like to just abolish the FDA outright, it would be better to put a lot of these executive agencies more directly under the legislative authority as opposed to the executive.
Gotcha, I understand. I don't really think it would change any of the problems because we already have the ability for the legislative to vote on different things for those executive authorities to do. But I guess backing out. So what does this have to do with Joe Biden? Sounds like you just hate the government.
Partially, yes. But no, actually, I think my biggest issue of Joe Biden is his foreign policy. I have always been a big stickler for foreign policy, and it's one of, in my opinion, the most important jobs of the president.
Mm-hmm.
Less so approving what Congress passes, less so the executive orders. His primary job should be to be America's face to the world and to run the military and our foreign policy effectively.
Okay.
And I don't see situations in which Joe Biden has done that effectively. I think he royally fucked up the pullout in Iran.
In Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, yes. And
how? Why do you say that?
He actually pushed back Donald Trump's date to pull out by 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that we did it at the beginning of summer is because terrorist activities go down in that area during the summer because it's hotter, and so there's less activity just in general. And he wanted the specific date of 9/11 to be the day that pulls out for whatever reason, most likely just because it looks really nice on paper. The problem is that when he does pull out, he doesn't do any of the proper planning. He doesn't actually take any effort to inform the government that this is happening. We leave a number of our allies behind in the area without any warning whatsoever. Immediately, our military bases get overrun, and a large number of our heavy machinery and heavy weaponry ends up in the hands of the people who immediately put a coup in Afghanistan.
So I understand some of the complaints about the Afghanistan pullout. I think it was done as well as it could have been. I know that there are a lot of people that get really triggered by it, but I think the issue is that we've already been in Afghanistan for over.
Oh no, I'm with you that we should never have been there to begin
and
with.
People talk about well, we could have prepared the government better. How? We dumped tens of billions. Was it $1 trillion in Afghanistan? It was a huge number of money.
Yeah, it's unnecessarily
into Afghanistan. Yeah, I don't think that another year would have helped. I don't think another 6 months would have helped. I don't think that I don't think at that point. I don't think there was anything else we could have done.
But we should never have had our allies waking up the day of trying to figure out what the hell is going on because we're just leaving.
I mean, all of these timelines were already on the table that we were going to be heading out. Like, maybe people just didn't believe it because, like, well, no, America will stay here forever. But I think at some point, I mean, like, I think we have to leave the country. We can't be there for till
you
the
had
time.
Biden on television saying this will not be like our exit of Vietnam. And literally, we were helicoptering people off of the embassies exactly like he said we would not be doing. He did not properly plan what he was pulling out.
There were a few people that were helicoptered off embassies. But at the end of the day, how many Americans died?
I believe no Americans died.
Yeah.
But
Americans
are not the only people that would matter here. We have allies in that nation that did.
Yeah, but then what was the alternative? Like, do you because do we start giving warnings ahead of time? So like, you guys all need to leave the country, and then you cripple the ANI even more, and then it's like.
You should. What you should have done is slowly pulled out over time, taking a third, then half, and slowly decrease the amount of power over time, while making sure that they're filling that power vacuum instead of just removing the power vacuum entirely.
Well, but
creating
I don't think the ANI had everything they needed. Like that, I don't think that there was ever going to be a drawdown that made them able to sustain against like the Taliban. Even if we would have left a third, a half, or whatever. And I think the scary part there, from Biden's point of view, and I think it's easy to look at it retroactively. This is what I look at, I guess, when I try to figure out was it good or not. We got everybody out. There were some deaths. It sucks, but for the most part, it was relatively peaceful.
We actually did not get everybody out.
We've gotten almost every American out. There's like
the CIA intentionally said that there were over 200 Americans left in Iraq.
Initially there was, but I'm pretty sure at this point, because I checked this like 6 months ago, I think every American that wanted to leave is out of Afghanistan.
I also just would not take what they say at face value.
Okay, we can take it, but then at the end of the day, we can just go by gut. But I think that the problem is that like the thing is we got everybody out and we're gone and we're done. But if we would have done these other strategies, retrospectively we look at it and we go like, oh well, he could have done this, could have done. If we would have like drawn down troops, less people there, slowly done it. Like let's say 6 months from now, we still have a few people there. The force is way smaller. Something happens, the Taliban attacks, or there's a terrorist attack, and now hold on, and then now like 20 Americans are killed. Now we're in the United States, like, oh my God, we need to go back and we need to get revenge. Now there's another troop surge. Now you're there for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Like, why risk it?
We should have done the pullout at the beginning of summer. Like that is just like it would have been better to do it then. I don't know why it was pushed back 3 months in the excuse of planning to then not improve the plan at all.
I guess it's just a matter of like how well could it have ever gone. I don't think there's ever us leaving Afghanistan 100% and it looking like super nice in all ways. Like it's always going to be like pretty shitty because like that government was never going to be able to stand on its own against the Taliban, getting support from so many other people in the region.
I mean, to an extent, yes. I unfortunately, I do agree with you in the fact that there is no way this could have ever gone well in that sense, because once you're there, it's already a problem.
And I understand that there are lives besides Americans that are worth considering, of course. But from a foreign policy point of view, when Americans start dying, we start turning our eyes, towards other countries and they get red. And like, if there would have been another attack, if we would have stayed even a little bit longer, and there would have been another attack, and like 20 or 30 American soldiers would have been killed, Jesus, we're not leaving after that. Now we're going to recommit.
There had been no fighting for the last 2 years. There had been a ceasefire.
Sure, but I think that was because we were under the understanding after the Doha agreements that the United States would be pulling out.
Yes.
And I think that's why the Taliban was like pretty chill, and that's probably why they didn't attack, because they knew we were leaving. And the Taliban doesn't want us there forever, obviously, because they want to take control of the country. Yeah.
Well, no, but I mean, again, if you had done this at the beginning of summer, you would have given at least the government of Afghanistan a modicum more amount of time to just get their feet on the ground before getting overrun.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, what was it, like 2 weeks, I think? And like
it was a day. It was like a day.
Okay, yeah. So like, I mean, I don't know. Maybe, but
and then
it's hard to like retroactively go back and say he should have done. Like all I see is that we got out, no American deaths. Like some people died, it sucked, but I mean like that. At least we're finally out of Afghanistan. Jesus.
Yeah, and then I also do believe that the view that Biden has on the world stage hurts our figure in the first place.
In what ways, or in what?
So I would say this: in 2012. We back a coup in Ukraine that overthrows a Russian-backed government. That's how Zelensky.
That's not what happened.
That's how Zelensky came to power.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
First of all, it's 2014, not 2012. But no.
No, because Crimea fell in 2014, which was a response to the 2012 Zelensky coming to power.
No. In
2014,
Crimea happened in response to oh my God,
I'm pretty sure
Yanukovych being ousted from the country in 2014.
Oh, I thought that happened in 2012.
No, it was 2014.
Okay.
But the Euromaidan protests and then eventually the revolution that happened. Firstly, people always point to this idea that there was like a U.S. coup in Ukraine.
No, backed coup. There's a difference.
U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine. Ukrainians were protesting for a long time for a lot of reasons. Ukraine was one of the most corrupt countries in the world prior to 2014.
It's still one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
I don't know if I'd say as much as it was prior to 2014.
Not as much, but it's still one of the most corrupt.
Listen, they're in a war.
Okay?
Okay?
You could make China 100% better country, and it's still one of the worst countries in the world.
I don't know if I would say that. I'm just saying that. So, for the evidence that there was a U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine is non-existent. I don't think there's any evidence to point to the fact that the U.S. backed the coup.
The U.S. gave the rebels resources. That's the U.S. backing the rebels.
No.
Yes.
No. There were no rebels in 2014. They were just protesters. They were the Euromaidan protesters. There weren't like official rebel groups to like give arms or weapons to.
this is not how historians usually view revolutions. I mean, at some point, we don't. When we talk about the Boston Massacre, we usually refer to them as the American revolutionaries, not the American protesters. But at that time, they were just protesters.
Sure, I'm just saying that like the reason why Yanukovych was ousted happened after I always fuck the name up. It's the Yellow Jacket Police started like shooting at protesters, and then people started to get obviously really mad because that was like the culmination of all the protests. Once police were firing on protesters and people started to get really mad, Yanukovych fled the country, and that like none of that needed U.S. support. There were no like U.S. arms flowing into the country with like tons of fighting with the government. None of that was happening. I've never seen any evidence presented that like it's a U.S.-backed coup. There's not like a ton of like freedom fighters on the ground. It's not like Syria or something.
No,
where
it's
there's a ton
not.
of people shooting and killing each other. Like it was 1 or 2 relatively violent days that ended up with Yanukovych fleeing the country.
And yes, when your active government flees the country and a new regime comes to power, that is a coup.
Well, they call it a revolution, but
It just depends on which side you support. That's the only difference on what those words are.
sure, it might be. But I mean, I'm going to probably support the side of the people that are trying to get representation of their government and not the guy that's trying to enact laws to violently oppress freedom of speech and not having his police officers shooting on protesters
and I
not
agree
ignoring
with
the
you.
will of their parliament.
And,
to, like,
I
pass
agree
trade
with you
deals
that they are
Russia.
that those protesters would be in the right. But what happens is because the U.S. Supports them, and we now end up with a large amount of influence and ties to this country with Joe Biden and his son on the board of Burisma, which
Board of Burisma has nothing to do with how Ukraine runs its policies. And also,
no, the
again,
country is incredibly corrupt, and Burisma is a major country that has ties in huge parts of their
the
government.
United States did not back any part of the revolution. There was no financial money flowing into like rebel groups. There was no U.S. arms flowing into that country. Like, it just didn't happen. There were plenty of reasons for those people to be protesting, and we know why Yanukovych fled the country.
No, just because.
And also, even
but
if
again,
this was
that's
the
not
case,
mutually exclusive to them. To the U.S. Giving support to these people.
what do you mean by support? I mean, like, I think on TV where we're saying like we back the Ukrainian people, I think there's some of that was going on, but like there weren't like arms flowing into the country or anything like that.
No, we did help Zelensky get into power.
No, we didn't. He was voted on. They voted for him.
Before Zelensky, there was no legitimate election in that country for a good 20 years. Why would Zelensky's be all of a sudden
Hold
a
on. I
legitimate
don't know if I'd
election?
say there was no legitimate election, but I don't even think Zelensky was the first president that came after the 2014 revolution. There was still, I think, a couple years before he was elected and the other guy. But the idea, what is the implication? That the United States, like, propped him up and put him into power? Or that there wasn't an actual election in Ukraine to vote Zelensky into office?
No. So I was actually kind of saying this as an explanation of just America's problematic history of interfering in Ukraine and us propping up Zelensky in the even after he came to power, but we never quite got there. And so the idea is just when we have such important ties in keeping this country in the state that it is already, when Russia starts to come into Crimea, all of this is in response to a major change of power in that region. And
yeah,
Russia
Russia
sees
going
it
to
as a
Crimea
threat to
was
them.
definitely because of
And
Yanukovych fleeing,
and
for
it's
sure.
Western support of Ukraine that makes him see Ukraine as a real threat.
Well, hold on. Where does Russia get the right to invade Crimea?
They don't.
So if Ukraine wants to be more Western aligned than Eastern aligned, doesn't Ukraine have the right to make that choice?
In one sense, yes. In another sense, not everything that people want is necessarily what's good for the world. So
what's good for the world is what your bully on your border wants for you? Like Russia gets to dictate Ukrainian foreign policy?
So yes and no. So Ukraine should never have joined the EU or NATO simply because...
Well, they're not in the EU or NATO, but they're
No,
looking
that's
to
what I'm
it,
saying.
yeah.
They do want to be a part of both, though.
Well, I mean, I can understand why,
Yeah.
because everybody's
And-
getting invaded. It's not.
But here's the thing, though, is if they had never fallen into the Western sphere of influence, they would never have been invaded by Russia, and
Yeah,
that
but
would
there are
never
people-
have threatened any sort of conflict between NATO
Yeah,
and
but
Russia
there are
at all.
people wanted to join the Western sphere of influence. People would rather have the deal on the table was a free market access to the European Union's trade union, or it was joining a customs tariff union with this Eurasian empire of Belarus and Russia. I think the Ukrainian people have a right to look west rather than to have Daddy Russia dictate to them.
Again, they
like
do,
tariffs
but that
and stuff.
doesn't mean that we have the right. That doesn't mean that necessarily we have the duty to accomplish that.
We
Like,
don't.
We don't know. So it might not be good for us to want that either.
Well, sure, but I think we can support the right to self-determination of the Ukrainian people.
In a sense, yes, but we also have the right to self-determination. So if we look at this and say, if you aligning with us causes a war in your region, that's not good for us. That's not good for
So
you.
then you're
then we should
actually
not-
asking us to coup people that
no.
like we disagree with.
No, I'm saying we shouldn't have supported them in any way whatsoever to begin with. If they
Well, I
want
think-
to,
but
if they
then-
want to have that conflict on their own, they're out. It's kind of one of these things where history sucks. People get invaded constantly.
No,
and
hold on.
and you
That's
have
not
to
a
deal
good.
with it.
We have the ability to do something. We can't just say history. That's like walking next to a pool.
If you
want to
say we have the
fall in,
ability
and
to
you're
do
like, oh, well,
something,
sucks,
you're,
some people drown.
if you
Like,
want to say we have the ability to do something, you're effectively pushing for what will turn into a major war with Russia.
if it does, that's Russia's choice. Russia's the invader.
No, but it doesn't have to be our war. That's
No,
the
we
problem.
could just let Ukraine get invaded and taken over, and then all of Europe was like, well, the U.S.
But they
sucks,
wouldn't have
so-
been invaded and taken over had they stayed a neutral country.
No, they wouldn't have been invaded and taken over if they would have let Yanukovych toss the deal that their parliament already voted on, and instead made Ukraine subservient to Russian foreign trade policy.
They don't have to do either.
They did. That was what Yanukovych did. That's why people were protesting so much, because Yanukovych said, "Nah, I don't want to do this EU thing. Actually, I'm going to go."
But again,
and do
if the protesters in that country do want to have their protest, they want to get a new government in place, and they end up
which they
having
did,
that.
and they did.
They did.
And
So
then
that
Russia
put-
invaded Crimea afterwards and started a civil war in the Donbass.
But again, Russia taking over one part of it does not mean that we then have to get involved. We don't have to be as
Yeah, we don't
don't
have
have
to.
we don't have to play the same game that they're doing. We don't have to be as bad as they are.
Well, I mean, you kind of have to take a stand, though, right? You can't, like, we're the strongest country in the world. If we see another country being invaded in Europe, right? I think it's
we
everybody's
don't
kind of
have
looking to
any
the.
treaties with Ukraine. We have no response.
It's not about
to support
treaties
them.
with Ukraine. It's about the general state of security across all of Europe, right?
That's what the treaties are for.
No, but there's also an ideology at play as well. Like NATO and the European Union are all looking to the United States to take leadership, to take point on, like, hey, Russia is invading countries.
Maybe they should
This
take
is-
leadership in their own corner of the world and stop looking to us.
Then what? Then the U.S. just abdicates its entire hegemony. The U.S. just like, oh, you guys figure your own shit out. Like, why would we do that? Why would we give up that influence?
Why do we need to be involved? How
We're
does
the leader
being
of the free
involved in-
world?
how
It
does the-
ensures us safe trade
how does
routes.
the-
We get awesome
But
trade
how
deals.
does being
like-
involved in Eastern Europe really help us that much? It really doesn't.
because it sends a statement that we live in a world that past 1991 where people don't take over parts of countries anymore and steal land from them. I think that international concept is a really important concept to defend. And the idea that big countries can
And
just
I would
step
agree
in
with
and-
you, but us saying that we don't want that to happen is not going to change the fact that it will happen.
Well, it is changing the fact in Ukraine right now that it's happening, right?
no, because Russia's still doing this. China
Russia
has,
is losing horribly against a country that it was supposed to take over in 2 weeks. So I
Well,
think the
they-
United States has been pretty successful so far.
in hindsight, Russia never had what they needed to actually take over Ukraine.
Maybe, but it's hard to say how successful Ukraine would have been without the massive amount of intelligence and support from the United States and other countries that have been like.
But again,
gathered by the United
I
States.
don't. Poland is in that region of the world. Poland has put a lot of like military and financial support behind Ukraine. If Poland wants to stand and be a leader of the Eastern Europe, let them be leader of Eastern Europe, and let us be the leader of the Western Hemisphere and over here in our home
And
town.
with Canada and Mexico.
all of South America, the Caribbean.
So I think that generally when we talk about like our sphere of influence and the allies and the relationships that we've built over time, I think our European allies are pretty close to us, pretty important. And I think ensuring like the general safety and security of Europe has been a pretty defining fact of Europe in the 90s and onwards. I think that having like a more stable continent that we're trading with, we're doing business with, we have a history with, I think that's a pretty important concept.
But again,
to defend.
they should be able to defend themselves. They
we
don't.
don't,
They
we
don't
want,
need us
we don't
for
want them
that.
to do everything on their own. We want to be their friend.
We can be their friend without saying that we will fight your battles for you.
We're not fighting battles for them. We're just giving help. Right? Ukraine's fighting the battle. It's their soldiers on the line. It's their
When
people
they
that
have
are-
our missiles and our officers telling them where to point them, and all they're doing is pulling the trigger, that's not
they're
necessarily.
the ones that are putting bodies like into the ground. They're the ones that are dying for their cause.
and most
then-
of their successes are coming from missile targets and taking
Sure.
out major military targets. That's mostly the U.S. is doing.
Sure, the U.S. has helped a lot for sure, but like it's Ukraine's war to fight, and they are fighting it, and it's their land to fight. And I think there's an important concept. Like let's roll the clock back, and let's say that we do do this. Let's say that Russia goes in and they just invade Ukraine, and now they just own Ukraine. Like, is
Well,
that an acceptable like?
That would never happen.
Why not?
For example, you would have to effectively take out all of Ukraine to do that.
Well, they already had Crimea. They had already had like they were doing okay in the Donbass. Like, if they were to do a full invasion like they did.
Well, the problem is that the Ukrainian people remember what it was like to be under the Soviet Union. They remember they remember the Holodomor. They don't want to be under Russian control again, and they will fight to the death for
you
that.
know,
To
we don't
prevent
know that. A lot of countries in the Soviet Union, a lot of the states didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. That's why when it dissolved in '91, that's why everybody was like, oh, well, we're leaving now.
Well, and that's why so many of them came to a Western sphere of influence, because Russia treated them horribly, and they remember that. It's
sure, but Ukraine is included there, right?
This is why. Some amount of self-determination in who your government is just better for the world, because it's harder to force people to be a part of a government they really, really don't want to be a part of. And Russia would effectively have to wipe out Ukrainians to get that done. I mean,
I don't think they would have to wipe out Ukrainians anymore. They didn't have to wipe out Belarusians to basically have Belarus be a puppet state of Russia. I think that they can keep a country under its thumb without wiping out all of the citizens. They essentially did the same thing in Georgia, too.
But again, they didn't just incorporate Belarus into Russia. The people in Belarus are part of the Belarusian government, not the Russian government. If Russia were to come in and take over Ukraine, they would in that sense have to.
I think they would want Ukraine to be another Belarus. I think their goal was they wanted to march into Kiev. They wanted to take over in 2 weeks. They wanted to install a new leader and then have them leave, and then the new leader would be like really partial to the Russian government, essentially.
Which is effectively what Ukraine had before that government got overthrown.
Yes, which is why they overthrew the government.
Again, why wouldn't it just happen again?
Because now you've got a Russian army invading and killing people and doing a huge show of force, saying like, well, if this happens again, we're actually going to invade you.
And this is exactly like the Holodomor, which the Ukrainian people don't want anymore. The Ukrainian people would never submit to that after what they went through in 2014.
I don't buy the argument that like Russia can't take it over without any foreign help. Like I think the foreign help has been pretty important to Ukraine being able to resist so far. Like I don't think without any foreign help they would just magically be able to fight off.
They had a lot of success in the initial. They didn't have the military support in the first 2 weeks. They didn't have material support in the first 2 weeks.
They had U.S. intelligence support at the very least since the very beginning, right?
Yeah, but and again, that's not necessarily the same as material support though. Like
Sure.
they on their own were able to to deal with a lot of Russian targets without having any real weaponry.
Sure, but do you think they would have the success in this war that they've had without U.S. support?
Absolutely.
No shot.
So the problem
Why
is,
would we be sending them tens of billions of dollars in weapons packages? Why is Zelensky and everybody begging us to continue to support if it didn't make that much of a difference? Like you said it yourself, like most of the victories they're scoring are with like U.S. missile systems and stuff being shipped in from like Poland and like other European countries too.
again, Poland can do whatever the hell they want. That doesn't mean that we should also be doing it. Poland has given them billions of dollars in missile systems, tanks, etc. They basically offloaded their entirety of their old Soviet systems into Ukraine for them to use.
Yeah, but I think part of this is due to U.S. leadership, like bringing everybody together to recognize that this is...
No, Poland hates Russia. Poland does not want to be.
I understand, but hating Russia and being willing to ship, because initially wasn't Poland initially fighting us on like shipping stuff to the country, like with planes and stuff? I think that wasn't it Biden that eventually got them to cave on that. And I know that Germany and France were reluctant to put some tariffs and sanctions on Russia as well. Like we had to fight a lot for them to get kicked out of the SWIFT banking system. Like I think the United States has taken point at a lot of these negotiations. I don't know if Poland would have helped in the same manner they are now if it wouldn't have been at the U.S.'s like kind of urging to do so.
No,
like, I know they hate Russia, but
no, I think if Russia got far enough in Ukraine, they would be all there for it.
Well, they get far enough in, then it's too late at that point.
If Poland knows that if Ukraine falls, they're next, and they don't want to be next.
Well, I don't think Poland is ever going to be next.
Yes. Historically, dictators don't stop once they've taken over a couple things. They keep going until they have nowhere else to go.
No, okay. I'm just making sure I wasn't crazy. No, Poland is in NATO. Poland's never falling. No NATO country. This is why the Baltics aren't worried about being invaded. Poland's not worried about being invaded. If you're part of NATO, you're not going to get invaded. This is why Ukraine wanted to be in NATO.
Not now.
What?
I mean, they don't have. They need to build up their military first.
They don't need their military. They have the United States. They're NATO.
No, Russia.
What about Russia? Russia's not invading a NATO country.
Not now. I'm saying they need to build up their military.
They won't. Even with the military, because it'd be nuclear war. It'd be over.
No, it wouldn't.
Yes, it would be.
No. Conventional warfare between two nuclear countries does not necessarily mean that you're going to have.
It would if it was between Russia and NATO and the United States. This is why Russia and the U.S. are so careful not to cross swords. It's because they know that that's where it could eventually lead, right?
It could. That doesn't mean it will.
No, but I don't think Russia's ever invading a NATO country. I think this is why Russia was invading not Poland. This is why Russia does invade Ukraine in the way that it does. When you keep those civil wars going in the southeast, you know that a country that's in conflict can't join NATO. It's why they only invade countries that aren't in NATO. It's why they try to shoot missiles or do anything with countries that are in NATO. It's the same strategy they did in Georgia is what they're doing now in Ukraine. I don't think Russia's going to fight. Yeah, I'll give you the last word on this. Go for it.
Oh no, I was just saying I have to go to class. So
yeah.
My thing is, I don't see a world in which the U.S. getting involved in hundreds of small wars throughout everywhere is any good thing. This has been a problem with U.S. presidents going back basically to World War I. We should not be getting involved in all of these wars across the world because when we do, it sets a precedent that we should be there for the next one. And the problem with that is that it puts American money and American lives in places that it does not need to. And the more involved we are in Ukraine, the more likely this becomes the U.S.'s actual involvement as opposed to this sort of pseudo-involvement where it's basically a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. And I don't think that we should be fighting proxy wars any more than real wars.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, listen,
Yeah.
I appreciate the conversation, my dude.
Thanks.
Yeah, have a good one. Oh, boy.
Are you ready to get banned from YouTube?
I'm not going to get banned from YouTube. All right. Well, go for it.
Trans women in sports.
Trans women in sports.
So,
You want me to start with my position and then you can attack?
sure.
So I think that sports through grade school and high school, I think, are like character building activities to get students involved in things like beyond the classroom without getting into trouble. And in that regard, I think that grade school sports and high school sports should be open to essentially whatever you identify as, with an exception to maybe combat sports if you do those in high school, so like wrestling and stuff. Past that, once you're at the collegiate level and you're talking NCAA sports, when spots become restricted and when scholarships are on the line, I think that you should have open division for like men's sports, and then I think you should have like a category for cis women, because I would say that the advantages that trans women possess over cis women make it so that the competition between the two groups is not necessarily fair on the basis of sex and gender. Yeah.
Right. So, I'm of the position that performance in sports is inherently based off of, some type of competitive, like, biological advantage you have.
Yep.
So, like, if you're, it's always going to be unfair.
Yep.
Because, like, nobody is, like, able to perform to the level of, like, anyone else.
Yep.
Like, if you're good at sports, then, like, you have some innate biological advantage over other people.
Yeah.
So for trans women in sports, I think that because I think, like, there's two arguments you can make. The first argument is that they're not women, so they shouldn't be in. But I don't think you would take that argument. And the second argument is that there's some advantage in sports. And I think that second argument kind of falls apart because, like, on the basis that they have, like, some inherent advantage, since, like, performance in sports is inherently based off.
Yeah.
If you have some sort of
So I've heard this argument before. So the idea is basically that, like, within a competitive group, some people are going to be more competitive than others because of some innate biological advantage that they literally have no ability to deal with, right? So, like, the most common example is people point to Michael Phelps. They'll say he's got, like, a huge torso. This guy was always going to be, like, a championship swimmer. People point to the NBA. They'll say these guys are freakishly tall. Like, I think the average height in the NBA is, like, 6. I want to say it's literally, like, 6'6" or something. It's huge. And so people will say, on that basis, if some biological advantages exist, then who cares? So the issue that you run into with that is just because some biological advantages exist doesn't mean that we can't, like, kind of draw a circle around some things to protect for some areas. So, for instance, we might look at, like, weight classes in wrestling, and somebody might say, like, well, why have a weight class? Just because you're both 160 pounds doesn't mean you're both going to be equally competitive. So if why have a weight class if some people are going to be biologically competitive more so at some things than others? And I think the answer would be, well, because we want people at different weight classes to be competitive. And then when it comes to sports, we say, well, some men are more biologically advantaged than other men, some women are more biologically advantaged than other women. If that's the case, then why draw a circle around anything at all? And I think it's because we want, like, cis women to be able to have, like, a place where they compete, where even though they have all of the natural disadvantages of being a woman, compared to, like, men in athletic events, they still have the ability to compete amongst themselves and then have, like, their own leagues and do everything. Right. But I think the issue with trans women is trans women remove a lot of the intrinsic disadvantages that the female anatomy carries with it when it comes to competition in, like, athletic competitions, and I think that's why it's okay to say, like, well, even if some female bodies are naturally better or worse at sports, trans female body is a bit different because they're inheriting a lot of advantages from, like, the male biology, which is what the, like, category is, like, kind of designed to exclude.
Okay,
go.
So if I were to, like, try to interpret your argument, the reason we separate male sports from female sports is because otherwise we wouldn't see any representation of like women.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Okay. So I guess my position there would be because we still do see representation of cis women in
Yeah.
sports. So I think like like even if we include like allowed trans women to like be in that whole thing. So my position there would be there isn't that kind of pressure we would have from like separating male and female sports.
Maybe. So there's two issues with that. So one, if I were to go and compete against women in any sport right now at this college, I would probably lose because I'm not a very athletic person. But I probably still shouldn't be allowed to compete because that's like where the rules are drawn. And then the second thing would be the problem with allowing competitors in that maybe shouldn't be is that if we get to a point in the future, sorry, I thought I was going to sneeze. If we get to a point in the future where trans people do become more where trans people do become more dominant in the category, it's going to be way too late to roll back the clock. So we had the Leah Thomas thing this time, which in the grand scheme of things wasn't really that significant. But like, let's say that we go down the road like 5 or 10 years, and now like in every single like top 10 like female sport, you're starting to see 1 or 2 trans people show up. If at that point we're like, okay, hold on, maybe this is like a problem, it's probably going to be too late to roll everything back, and then like you're kind of fucked on the if you're like cis women competing on that level. I think you run into a weird area.
Why would it be too late to roll everything back?
Well, because culturally that's where we'll be at, and to try to roll anything back at that point, like it would look really bad, I think.
I mean, culturally we're at a point where men's sports was like the only thing, and then we separated out women's sports.
Yeah.
So, let's say 5 or 10 years down the line, we're at a point where like trans women are like they have pushed cis women out.
Sure.
Yeah, just like we did for like women in men's sports.
Yeah, but do you really think we would ever be able to say like, okay, well, this is too much, now we're going to create a trans women's division? I don't think that would happen.
Well, if like the primary representation is like trans women, I imagine we'd separate out.
I feel like I don't know if that would happen. Because I feel like, because even in the recent thing where they tried to push for it, I felt like everybody basically would just accuse you of being transphobic if you would say that, like, well, maybe there should be different divisions. I don't know if it hit that level of widespread, like, representation. I don't know if we'd be able to roll it back. And then also, like, following back on my first argument, I still don't think, I feel like there are enough arguments that it's not, like, fair competition because of all the biological advantages inherent to being a trans woman versus, like, a cis woman.
Well,
that, like,
my argument would be that the biological advantage doesn't matter since it's like sports is based off of.
Well, but I mean, like the problem is some of the biological advantages are like intrinsic to like the male biology, I guess. So like one example might be like it's an advantage, for instance, to have like exogenous hormones. Like as a trans woman, you can theoretically regulate your hormones better than a cis woman can, because like the menstrual cycle will cause like big fluctuations around like periods, especially, and everything. That makes it really difficult for women to train like very hard around certain times for their period and stuff. That's one thing. A second thing might be we've seen like a lot of studies now showing differences in like lean muscle mass attainment and like maintaining this even after like a few years of like HRT and everything. So it seems like, and these are things that like it's not just like natural variation in female bodies. It's like these are like natural advantages generally conferred to men going through like male puberties and stuff.
Sure, but if like we were to take like Usain Bolt for example, like the natural variation in like his like ability to run is not within the natural variation of like your average.
Sure, but he's not getting his ability to run like through like a superpowered uterus or something, right? Like it's part of like the male biology still. Here's like a question. I'll flip this back, okay? Because nobody ever wants to talk about men. Everybody hates men, okay? Including trans men. I feel like this is never talked about, but if we keep sports where trans women can compete with women, cis women, wouldn't it would then follow that like trans men are probably competing with cis men, but like how? Trans men will never be competitive in sports with like cis men. Are they just like completely erased, or?
If I were to be consistent, I guess so.
Because that seems like it would suck for.
I mean, it would, yeah.
Yeah, because then trans men now have like no representation anywhere, basically. So.
Lack of representation of like women, so like we kind of separated that out from men's sports. So.
But then if we seem like on one end we acknowledge that like trans men might need their own division because trans men won't compete with cis men. But then you've got cis women who are like, well, fuck, but we have to compete with trans women. If you acknowledge on one end that it's impossible for trans men to compete with cis men, why can't you acknowledge that it's difficult for cis women to compete with trans women?
I mean, I'm not denying that like there might be some advantage. What I'm saying is like there isn't like it hasn't been demonstrated that like cis women are being like pushed out.
It hasn't
Yeah.
been demonstrated they're being pushed out yet, but I think that's because of the number of trans competitors, and probably or competitors, not computers, and also probably because trans people also inherently have a lot of other challenges they face in life that probably keeps them from becoming super competitive in like collegiate level sports. But like I would imagine once like trans people reach higher levels of acceptance when they're transitioning more effectively and they're competing more, yeah, I guess. It feels like right now the scientific literature points heavily in the direction of like trans women maintaining like a pretty big advantage over cis women, and like even if it is a small number, it just seems like it would be so shitty. Like if you're like the cis woman that gets like second place instead of first, or if you're the cis woman that doesn't get like that scholarship, or you don't even get a place on the team, and there's like one or two trans women there, like I can see some like cis women being like, this is fucked. What the fuck?
I mean, yeah, you could say that, but like I feel like that could, like if you're, like my argument will always come down to sports are inherently based off like some biological advantage. So like if you're a cis woman and you get second place, like
Well, sure, but then in that case, why not just mix all sports together and have no categories at all?
so we separated out women's sports from men's sports.
Well, but if some people have some biological advantage, or if it's all based on biological advantage, why separate men and women at all?
Well, I mean that's like a cultural choice we've made.
Sure, but if we've made that cultural choice, then we're acknowledging that some advantages come from men and some advantages come from women. So it seems like to respect it in some sense and not respect it in other sense, it seems like.
Right, but we don't have the issue with representation where cis women are being like excluded from like women's sports.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you think if it got to the point to where trans women were competing and doing too well.
Yeah, I think I would. And so in the same way we have like disabled sports, Paralympics, I think. Like we've sectioned that off from like wider athletics. So I think like, if it came to a point where cis women were being pushed out of women's sports, I think I'd support it then.
Okay. All right. Well, any other comments, thoughts, topics?
Did I change your mind?
No. Not at all. Nice try though. But I appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Cool. Thanks.